Imagine being accused of something so terrible that even your own parents turn their eyes away from you because your sister swore it was true. That was the moment Daniel Harrow's life broke apart. At 26, he was steady, careful, and proud of the reputation he had built at work. He stayed late at the office when deadlines pressed, paid his share of rent on time, and rarely caused a fuss at home. His sister Marissa, 3 years younger, was different, charming when she wanted something, reckless when no one was watching, but always the one their parents seemed to protect. One gray afternoon, Daniel pulled into the driveway and saw 2 patrol cars parked outside. Before he could make sense of it, officers stepped toward him, asking if he was Daniel Harrow. He nodded, confused, and they told him there had been a tip about drugs in his vehicle. His chest tightened as they opened his car door and searched. Within minutes, an officer lifted a plastic bag filled with white powder from beneath the passenger seat. Daniel's mouth went dry. "I've never seen that before," he said, his voice shaking. But the officers looked at him like they'd heard it 100 times. Inside, his parents stood rigid in the living room. His mother's lips were pressed tight, his father's arms folded across his chest. Then Marissa stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. She said she had seen Daniel using, that she didn't know how to stop him, and that maybe this arrest would save him before it was too late. Daniel froze. The room spun around him. He wanted to scream, to grab her shoulders and demand why she was lying, but his parents' faces stopped him cold. Their expressions weren't questioning, they were condemning. His mother whispered, "Daniel, how could you?" He reached for words, but they failed. Every defense sounded hollow when the evidence sat in a plastic bag on the hood of a police car, and his own sister painted him as an addict. He tried anyway. He swore he had never touched drugs, that Marissa was lying, that something didn't make sense. But Gerald shook his head, disappointment etched deep across his features. "You've always been responsible," his father said quietly. "But if she says she saw it, what are we supposed to think?" The betrayal cut sharper than the handcuffs. His sister had set him up, and instead of questioning her, his parents embraced the story as truth. Daniel felt like the walls of the home he had lived in since childhood were closing in, pushing him out. That night, while officers processed paperwork and his parents stood by in silence, Daniel's thoughts raced. The drugs weren't his. He knew it, but proving that was another story entirely. What he couldn't understand, what tore at his chest even more than the charges, was how easily his family had turned against him. One lie from Marissa, and everything he had worked for, every piece of trust he thought was unshakable, fell to the ground. For Daniel, that night marked not just the beginning of a legal battle, but the death of something far more personal, the belief that his family would always believe in him. Daniel sat at the kitchen table the next morning, wrists sore from the night before, his mind still replaying the sound of the police car door slamming shut. He wanted to believe that, after sleeping on it, his parents would realize something was wrong. He waited for a hint of doubt in their voices, but when they finally spoke, it was worse than silence. His mother's eyes looked tired, her tone heavy with sadness. "Daniel, we want to help you. Please stop denying it. Marissa wouldn't make up something like this." The words burned. He tried to explain again, slower this time, that the bag wasn't his, that he had no reason to throw everything away after years of building a stable life. His voice cracked when he begged them to look at him, to really see him, not the picture Marissa had painted. But instead of hearing him, they glanced at each other as though his insistence was proof of guilt. Marissa sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, speaking softly as if she were the victim. "I didn't want to say anything, but I couldn't keep watching you go down this road. You need help before it destroys you." Her words dripped with false concern, carefully chosen to make her seem selfless. Daniel wanted to shout, to demand why she was lying, but the weight of his parents' disapproval kept him still. Every time he tried to defend himself, Marissa tilted her head and looked hurt, like she couldn't understand why he was angry at her for caring. It twisted the knife deeper. By the afternoon, the story had already spread within the family. His uncle called to say he was disappointed, that he hoped Daniel would get clean. His aunt texted him to pray for strength. He hadn't even spoken to them himself. Marissa had beaten him to it. His parents didn't correct them, and the silence was confirmation enough. Overnight, he had become the shame of the Harrow name. At work, the consequences came fast. His boss called, voice clipped, saying Daniel would be placed on leave until the case was cleared. No discussion, no room for protest. Just one accusation, and everything he had worked toward was slipping through his fingers. When he returned home that evening, a duffel bag sat by the front door. His father stood beside it, arms folded, not meeting his eyes. "It's best if you stay somewhere else for a while," he said firmly. No argument, no warmth, just a decision made without him. Daniel carried the bag to his car, the same car that had been tainted by his sister's setup, and drove to a cheap apartment across town. The air smelled of mildew, and the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing. He sat on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how quickly his life had unraveled. He felt the sting of betrayal more than the fear of charges. His own family believed Marissa without question. They saw him not as the man who had stood by them for years, but as a reckless addict too stubborn to admit his problem. Every call from relatives reminded him of the label he couldn't peel off: disappointment. Lying awake at night, Daniel realized this was more than just bad luck. It was a deliberate move. Marissa had planted the evidence, spun the story, and won the trust of their parents. She had everything: sympathy, credibility, support, while he had nothing but his own word, which no one cared to hear. It was then that anger began to build inside him. Not the hot, uncontrollable kind, but the steady burn that grows stronger each time someone turns their back. He knew he couldn't fight this battle with just words. If Marissa had built her lie so carefully, he would need the truth to cut through it. And though his parents had chosen sides, he promised himself he wouldn't stop until he proved her. Daniel's phone barely rang anymore. The few friends who once invited him out for late dinners or weekend games stopped calling after the news of his suspension spread. At first, he thought it was bad timing, that maybe they were busy. But the silence stretched on. Messages he sent were left unanswered. The people he had trusted most chose distance, afraid his trouble might somehow spill onto them. Each day in the small apartment felt heavier than the last. The rooms were quiet, the air stale, and the thin mattress creaked every time he turned over. The neighbors' voices pushed through the walls, arguments and laughter that only reminded him how alone he had become. He carried groceries up the narrow stairwell without a word to anyone. No familiar voices called his name. No one checked if he was eating or sleeping. The hardest part wasn't the apartment or even the lost job. It was the weight of his parents' rejection. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the look on his father's face, the way his mother had pulled her sweater tighter, as if she needed protection from her own son. It echoed louder than the silence around him. Daniel thought back to childhood, to the years when Marissa cried because classmates teased her. He remembered walking her home, holding her backpack while she wiped her eyes, telling her she was stronger than their cruel words. He remembered standing up to boys bigger than him, just to shield her from their laughter. Those memories had always been proof to him that family stood by each other. Now, those same memories twisted inside him. The girl he had protected had grown into the woman who destroyed his reputation with a lie. Nights dragged on longer than days. Without work to distract him, Daniel counted hours by the hum of the refrigerator and the flicker of the streetlight outside his window. He tried to sleep but often lay awake until morning, replaying everything that had happened. He searched for signs he had missed, clues that Marissa was capable of setting him up. All he could find were moments of tension, small arguments about who got more attention, or complaints from her about feeling overshadowed. At the time, he thought they were normal sibling fights. Now he saw them as seeds of something darker. One evening, he drove past his parents' house, parking far enough away so no one noticed. The lights were on in the living room, shadows moving across the curtains. He imagined them sitting around the table, maybe laughing, maybe listening to Marissa retell her story. He wasn't welcome inside anymore. The thought cut so deep that he started the engine and left before the ache in his chest turned unbearable. Bills piled up quickly. Without his paycheck, Daniel dipped into his savings. He told himself it was temporary, that something would change, but fear crept in each time he opened his empty fridge. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity, the sense that he was slipping further into a role he never chose. Despite the weight pressing down on him, Daniel held onto one truth: the drugs were not his. He knew it, even if no one else did. And as lonely as his days became, the quiet anger inside him refused to fade. It whispered to him in the silence, reminding him that if he could find proof, everything Marissa had built against him would crumble. Daniel was used to silence, so when his phone finally buzzed one evening, he almost ignored it. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't seen in months: Claire. She had been his neighbor growing up, the kind of friend who had shared bike rides, secret forts, and summers spent chasing fireflies. They had drifted apart after college, but her voice on the other end felt like a thread pulling him back to steadier ground. "I heard what happened," she said softly, "and I don't believe it." Those words alone cracked something in. For weeks, everyone had looked at him with suspicion or pity, but Claire spoke with certainty. She didn't ask if it was true. She told him she knew it wasn't. They met the next day at a small cafe. Daniel looked worn down, his shoulders heavy, his eyes dim. Claire studied him carefully and said, "You can't go through this alone. You need someone who can fight back." He admitted he didn't know where to start. His savings were already shrinking, and lawyers sounded expensive. But Claire leaned in, determination flashing in her eyes. "I know someone. Mitchell Kane. He's tough in court, but he listens. He helped my cousin once, and he'll help you too." A few days later, Daniel sat in a small office that smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Across the desk sat Mitchell Kane, a man in his 40s with sharp features softened by calm eyes. He didn't rush Daniel. He asked him to tell everything from the beginning. For the first time since his nightmare started, someone listened without interrupting, without judgment. When Daniel finished, Kane leaned back, tapping a pen lightly on his notepad. Your sister's story has gaps. If she planted that bag, we'll find it. But you need to hold steady. No outbursts, no reckless moves. We'll let the facts speak. Daniel nodded, but doubt still lingered. He had heard promises before, from people who later abandoned him. Kane must have noticed the hesitation, because he added, I've seen cases like this fall apart under pressure. Truth has a way of surfacing when you dig deep enough. Leaving the office, Daniel felt lighter than he had in weeks. It wasn't relief yet, but it was something close, a spark of hope that maybe the nightmare could end. Claire walked beside him, her presence steady, reminding him that not everyone had turned their back. That night in his small apartment, Daniel replayed Kane's words. He thought about how Marissa had smiled so sweetly while lying, how his parents had swallowed every word. Now, for the first time, he imagined a day when the truth might actually crush her story. The anger inside him steadied into something sharper, resolve. He didn't know how long the fight would take, or how many more nights he would spend alone in that dim apartment. But he knew this. He wasn't completely powerless anymore. Someone believed in him. Someone was willing to stand beside him. And that changed everything. Mitchell Kane worked quietly, but with focus. Daniel handed over every detail he could remember. The time he came home that night, where his car was parked, even who lived nearby. Kane wrote everything down, his questions precise, his tone steady. He promised Daniel that small cracks could break open a whole case if you looked close enough. A week later, Kane called Daniel back to his office. The lawyer's desk was covered in files, and his expression carried a hint of progress. He slid a paper across the table. The lab results are in. The fingerprints on the bag, they aren't yours. Daniel stared at the page, his hands trembling. It was the first piece of proof that the nightmare wasn't just in his head. Kane's voice was calm but firm. This doesn't clear you completely, but it tells us the bag didn't come from your hands. That matters. Hope flickered, but Daniel stayed quiet, afraid to let relief wash over him too soon. He had already felt how quickly things could fall apart. Kane wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. There's something else. One of your neighbors has a security camera pointed toward the street. I asked them to review the footage. Daniel's chest tightened as Kane opened a laptop and pressed play. The grainy black and white video showed his driveway at night. Hours passed in fast motion, then slowed as a figure appeared. A woman in a hooded sweatshirt moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder. She approached Daniel's car, tugged at the door handle, and slipped inside. A few minutes later, she left. The angle wasn't perfect, but her frame, her walk, it was unmistakable. It was Marissa. Daniel's stomach churned. He leaned closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. Kane paused the footage at the clearest frame, then looked up. This was the night before the police arrived. The truth hit Daniel like a wave. All his doubts, all the sleepless nights, had pointed here. His sister had set him up, and now there was proof. Not suspicion, not just his word, actual proof. He dropped his face into his hands, not sure whether to cry or laugh. Kane gave him a moment before speaking again. This changes everything. We'll bring this to court, and we'll make sure the story comes out the way it should. Daniel lifted his head, still in disbelief. For weeks, he had been painted as a liar, an addict, the family shame. Now the first threads of her lie were unraveling. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment with the image burned into his mind, Marissa sneaking into his car. He remembered the times he had carried her backpack home from school, the nights he told her not to be afraid of the dark. He had stood for her again and again, only for her to twist his life into ruin. But this time, he wouldn't just sit in silence. This time, the truth was on his side, and it was powerful enough to shatter her story piece by piece. Daniel wanted nothing more than to drive straight to his parents' house, slam the laptop on the table, and force Marissa to watch the footage. Every part of him burned with anger, but Kane stopped him. Not yet, the lawyer said firmly. Evidence is strongest when revealed at the right time. If you confront her now, she'll twist it, maybe even destroy other proof. Let me handle the timing. Daniel clenched his fists, struggling to hold back. The thought of Marissa smiling, still playing the victim, made his chest ache. But Kane's voice stayed steady. You've waited this long. Trust me, you'll want the truth to come out where it matters most. So Daniel stayed quiet, though it ate at him. Days blurred together as he went to bed with the same thought repeating. His sister had framed him, and his parents believed her lies. The silence of his apartment pressed down on him harder with each passing night. When he did see his parents, the distance between them grew wider. His father spoke in clipped tones, his mother avoided his eyes. They no longer asked how he was doing. Instead, they repeated words that felt like knives. You've always had a rebellious streak, Gerald muttered one evening. Maybe this was bound to happen. Daniel stood frozen, his jaw tight. It didn't matter that he had worked long hours, paid his bills, or lived responsibly. His past, a few teenage arguments, staying out late once or twice, had been twisted into a story that fit Marissa's lie. Nancy, his mother, sighed heavily. I just wish you'd admit it. If you would just tell the truth, maybe we could help you. Her voice wasn't angry, but the disappointment behind it crushed him. She didn't see him as her son anymore. She saw him as the addict Marissa invented. Those words followed him into the night, keeping him awake until dawn. He lay in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the hum of the fridge and the shuffle of footsteps above him. Sleep refused to come. His mind circled the same loop. His parents didn't believe him, his friends had left, his sister was winning. Each morning, exhaustion dragged him down. His reflection in the mirror grew pale and thin. The weight of betrayal felt heavier than the case itself. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about being abandoned by the very people he had trusted most. Still, Kane's warning echoed in his head. Hold steady. Daniel forced himself to stay quiet, to wait for the day the truth would cut through every lie. He told himself he could survive the cold shoulders, the cruel comments, the nights alone. But he couldn't deny how deeply it hollowed him out. Every time Marissa's name came up, his chest tightened. He pictured her sitting at the kitchen table, telling their parents she was only helping. He imagined her satisfied smirk when they nodded, believing every word. Daniel carried that image with him everywhere, fuel for the storm building inside. And though he said nothing for now, he knew one thing. The moment of confrontation was coming. And when it did, he wouldn't need to shout. The evidence would speak for him. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of place where whispers carried and every footstep seemed louder than it should. Daniel sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had imagined this day for weeks, but now that it was here, the weight of it pressed on his chest. Marissa walked into the courtroom with her hair neatly tied back, wearing a pale blouse that made her look fragile. She sat down, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had been crying all night. Daniel knew it was part of the act. When her turn to testify came, she rose slowly, gripping the edge of the witness stand as if the truth itself was too heavy to bear. Her voice trembled when she spoke. I love my brother, she began, pausing for effect. I never wanted this to happen, but I saw the signs. I knew he was in trouble, and I couldn't just stand by. Tears slid down her cheeks as she described Daniel as someone spiraling, someone she feared would hurt himself if no one intervened. She painted herself as a reluctant hero, a sister forced into betrayal to save the person she loved most. Daniel clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. He wanted to shout, to tell the judge she was lying, but Kane placed a calming hand on his arm. Wait, the lawyer whispered. The prosecution nodded along as Marissa dabbed her eyes with a tissue. For a moment, it seemed her story was unshakable. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. Then Kane rose. His voice was calm, measured. Your Honor, the defense would like to present evidence. He held up the lab report first. These are the fingerprints found on the bag of narcotics. They do not match my client's. He placed the papers on the bench, his tone steady but sharp. The judge glanced at them, her brow furrowing. Kane didn't stop. He walked to the projector and clicked a remote. The courtroom screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage from the neighbor's camera. The timestamp glowed in the corner. There, in black and white, was Marissa, hood pulled over her head, moving toward Daniel's car. The video showed her opening the door, climbing inside, and leaving minutes later. The courtroom grew still. The sound of the video playing filled the silence like a drumbeat. When Kane paused the clip, the figure's face was faintly visible, but her walk, her shape, her timing, it was undeniable. Kane turned back toward the witness stand. Miss Harrow, would you like to explain why you were inside your brother's car the night before the police arrived? Marissa's face drained of color. She stammered, searching for words, but nothing came. The tears that had once drawn sympathy now looked like tools of manipulation. The judge's eyes hardened, shifting from curiosity to disapproval. For the first time, Daniel saw his sister's mask crack. Her hands trembled, her lips pressed tight, and her story unraveled in front of everyone. The gavel struck once. The judge's voice was stern. This court takes perjury seriously. I suggest you consider your next words carefully. Daniel sat in silence, his heart pounding. He didn't need to speak. The evidence had spoken for him. At last, the lies were breaking apart under the weight of truth. The courtroom was quiet after the judge's words, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. Daniel sat still, breathing slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't want to look at anyone, not even when Kane closed the laptop and the screen went dark. When he finally lifted his gaze, he saw his parents. Nancy sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Gerald leaned forward slightly, his face pale, his eyes locked on Marissa. Neither of them spoke. They didn't turn toward Daniel. They didn't apologize. They just sat frozen, as if the ground had been pulled from under them. Marissa broke the silence first. Her voice was shrill, cracking under the pressure. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted someone to notice me. Everyone always thought Daniel was perfect, never me. I wanted him to fail for once. Just once." The words hung in the air, raw and ugly. The jury shifted in their seats. The prosecutor looked down at his notes, clearly defeated. Even the judge's expression softened slightly, not in sympathy but in disappointment, as though she was watching a child unravel before her eyes. Daniel listened, but the confession didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, like something inside him had snapped and could never be repaired. He had imagined this moment so many times, proof coming out, Marissa exposed, the weight lifting off his shoulders. But instead of triumph, there was only emptiness. He glanced again at his parents. His mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. His father's jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. Neither of them defended Marissa now. Neither of them defended him either. They sat in silence, trapped between guilt and shame, but offering nothing to the son they had doubted. Daniel realized in that moment that the damage was done. The evidence cleared his name, but it couldn't erase the weeks of betrayal. It couldn't undo the words whispered behind his back, the looks of disappointment, the nights spent alone because his parents believed a lie. Marissa sobbed loudly now, her shoulders shaking. "I just wanted someone to care about me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "I didn't think it would ruin everything." The bailiff moved closer, ready to step in if needed. The judge tapped the gavel once, her tone sharp. "Order in the court." Daniel didn't move. He watched his sister fall apart, her act finally stripped away. He felt no anger left, no urge to shout. What filled him was a quiet ache, a deep sadness that his family had crumbled like this, that the people who should have stood by him had turned so quickly. As the judge called for a recess, Daniel rose slowly. His parents still hadn't spoken. He walked past them without a word, without even waiting for them to meet his eyes. For the first time, he understood that silence could be louder than accusations. The charges were dismissed, and with them a heavy weight lifted from Daniel's shoulders. Walking out of the courthouse, he felt air fill his lungs in a way it hadn't for weeks. He was free, his name cleared, but the scars left behind were not so easily erased. Kane shook his hand firmly before leaving, while Claire stayed by his side, her steady presence reminding him that not everyone had abandoned him. Soon after, Daniel received the call he had been waiting for. His company reinstated him. His boss admitted the suspension had been necessary while the case played out, but assured him they were glad to have him back. Returning to the office felt strange. Some colleagues welcomed him with smiles, but others avoided eye contact, as though they didn't know what to say. Daniel didn't mind. Just sitting at his desk again, opening files, and working through numbers gave him back a piece of his life that had been taken from him. Claire became his anchor during those days. She encouraged him to focus on small victories, making dinner at his apartment, taking walks to clear his mind, laughing at little things when the heaviness threatened to take over. Her loyalty reminded him of what real friendship looked like, the kind that didn't vanish when lies clouded the air. But while work and friendship offered some comfort, home was another story. Nancy and Gerald visited him not long after the trial ended. They sat stiffly in his apartment, the same parents who once turned him away from the house. Their voices trembled as they told him they were sorry. They admitted they had been wrong to believe Marissa so quickly, wrong to shut him out without proof. Daniel listened quietly. The words were there, but they felt thin, almost rehearsed. It wasn't anger that stopped him from forgiving. It was memory. He could still see the way they had looked at him in those first moments. Eyes filled with judgment, not love. That wasn't something an apology could erase. Marissa, meanwhile, had been ordered into rehabilitation. The decision came after the court considered her actions and her confession. Daniel knew about it only through reports. He didn't visit her, didn't write, didn't ask how she was doing. A part of him wished he could, but every time he thought about her, he remembered the nights alone in his small apartment, the whispers of neighbors, the way she had smiled while claiming she was only helping him. Distance felt safer than reconciliation. Life moved forward, but it carried a different rhythm. Family dinners were no longer the same. When Daniel did visit, the air at the table felt strained. His parents tried to act normal, asking about his work or Claire, but their voices carried a nervous edge, as though they feared saying the wrong thing. He responded politely but never fully opened up. In quiet moments, he reflected on what had been lost. Trust, once broken, didn't grow back quickly. Though he had cleared his name, the people closest to him had shown how easily they could doubt. That wound ran deeper than any public accusation. Daniel chose to focus on what he could control: his work, his friendships, his own peace. He didn't look for revenge or approval anymore. What mattered was the life he was building for himself, one day at a time, far from lies, far from betrayal. The past remained a shadow, but it no longer defined him. Daniel sat alone in his apartment, the night unusually quiet. The city outside moved on as if nothing had happened, but inside those four walls, the weight of everything he had been through pressed down on him. He thought back to the morning police had shown up, the shock of being accused, and the disbelief in his parents' eyes. None of it felt real anymore, almost like a nightmare that blurred into memory. Yet the sting of betrayal was still sharp, a wound deeper than any accusation the law had thrown at him. He whispered to himself what had become clear over time. It wasn't the drugs that had nearly destroyed him, it was the fact that his own family had turned against him. The people who were supposed to believe in him most, who were supposed to protect him, had let him fall without hesitation. They had accepted Marissa's words without a second thought, and that betrayal had burned through him more than the charges ever could. The court had given him back his freedom, his job had returned, and his name was cleared, but the scars were not something any judge could erase. He knew those scars would follow him for life, small reminders that trust was fragile and family could fail you in the worst way. For a long time, he had wanted justice, and in a way, he got it. The evidence had uncovered the truth. Marissa had faced the consequences, and his parents had been forced to see how wrong they were. But justice did not bring comfort. It only confirmed how broken things had become. Still, as he sat there in the dim light of his apartment, Daniel realized something important. He had survived. Through the silence, the shame, the loneliness, he had not collapsed. He had endured every cold look, every accusation, and every sleepless night, and he was still standing. That survival was a victory in itself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. It was his proof that no matter how much his sister wanted to ruin him, no matter how quickly his parents had doubted him, he had risen above it. Survival, he thought, was its own kind of revenge. Not the kind that destroys others, but the kind that shows strength where weakness was expected. Marissa had wanted him to break, to crumble so she could stand taller. His parents had doubted his character, believing he was someone he never was. Yet here he was, living, rebuilding, and moving forward, while their guilt and regret would linger long after the case was closed. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the quiet fill the room. His life was not the same, and it might never be. The family he once trusted without question was fractured, the bond cut deeper than words could mend. But he had something stronger now, clarity. He knew who he could count on, who had stood beside him when the world seemed against him. That knowledge, painful as it was, gave him a new kind of freedom. He didn't need revenge in the way most people imagined it. He didn't need to hurt Marissa back or make his parents beg for forgiveness. His revenge was in living a life she couldn't ruin, in proving them all wrong simply by refusing to give up. Survival had carried him through the storm, and in that, he found a strength he hadn't known he possessed.